Hello everyone, hope you're having a great day today. Today we're talking about the sociological aspects of sport management. This is chapter 18. So an important step in becoming a successful sport manager is gaining in-depth awareness of a sport as a social, political, and economic activity that permeates our society and influences institutions and people in a variety of ways. To understand the complex dynamics of how and why people participate in sport and physical activity, you must have knowledge about individual behavior, the psychological processes such as motivation to participate, and the social context in which that behavior occurs. For nearly 40 years, the scientific investigation of the relationships and social worlds that people create, maintain, change, and contest in and through sport has been at the heart of an academic discipline called sports sociology. According to Coakley in 2015, sports sociology is a sub-discipline of sociology that studies sports as social phenomena. Sports sociologists rely on sociological theories and concepts to examine institutions and organizations, such as the IOC, microsystems, such as women's professional basketball teams, or subcultures, such as sport gamblers. As part of their analysis, sports sociologists do not typically focus on the behavior of specific people. Instead, they examine the symbols, the social patterns, structures, and organizations of groups that are actively engaged in sport and physical activity. An underlying assumption of sports sociology is that sport is an important institution of the same magnitude as the family, the educational system, and our political structure. A fundamental goal of sports sociology is to describe the complex dynamics surrounding patterns of participation, such as the number of girls versus the number of boys involved in youth sports. Social concerns, such as an overemphasis on winning that may lead to the use of steroids, and symbols, such as mascots, that make up this all-pervasive institution. Another way the significance of sport is highlighted is to see how the individual acts and governance. Rather than examining the behavior of specific people, sports sociologists examine the institutions, the organizations, and the subcultures. The sociological aspects and prevalence of legal and illegal gambling in sports are examined by some sports sociologists and often come to symbolize broader social concerns. Sport shapes and maintains many social values that are held in high regard, such as hard work and fair play, self-discipline, sacrifice, and commitment to oneself and others. Many researchers over time have documented that sport participation can lead to greater health and well-being, as well as social, emotional, moral, physical, and psychological development. In short, sport has the potential to contribute to the positive development and stability of individuals and society. Sport as a socializing agent. The socialization process refers to the various ways in which a society's dominant values, attitudes, and beliefs are passed down from generation to generation. Socialization also pertains to the process of starting, continuing, changing, and discontinuing sports, as well as the effect of sport participation on the individual player. Children learn from coaches, parents, teachers, peers, and siblings about what is normative, important, valued, and expected in a sport context, which helps them construct meaning of their experiences. In addition, what and who are portrayed in the sport media communicate values and attitudes to consumers and spectators about what is important. Sport can bring people together by giving them a sense of personal identity and fostering feelings of group membership and social identification. Sport accomplishes feelings of unity in a number of additional ways. From the individual level, such as an athlete who feels that she is part of something bigger than herself because she is at the University of Minnesota, to the regional level, where citizens' professional sport teams such as the Celtics and Bruins and Red Sox banded together to raise money to help victims of the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing, to the national and international levels. The entire nation cheering for athletes in the Olympic Games. Few, if any, institutions can unite people the way that sport does, largely because the popularity of sport cuts across social categories such as race and class. Although sport can be unifying and have beneficial outcomes for individuals and society, involvement in sport does not bring only good things. It can also be exclusionary and divisive in terms of race, class, gender, age, ability, and sexual orientation and their complex intersections. For example, not all families can afford the rising pay-to-play fees of professionalized youth sport. Seats inside professional sports stadiums funded by public tax dollars are expensive, that only a small minority of people can afford to attend a game in the very stadium they helped fund. Participation rates are lowest, and the number of barriers to sport participation and physical activity are the greatest for underserved girls. Girls for whom geography, class, race, gender, and ethnicity intersect. A change in cultural beliefs pertaining to impaired athletes is occurring. In early 2013, the U.S. Department of Education amended and released new guidelines for the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 that will help ensure equal access to school-based sports for disabled students. While this change has moved in the right direction, improvements in access and accommodation for impaired athletes has come slowly. As is apparent, sport participation can have a darker side. This dark side of participation includes aspects such as sexual and emotional abuse of athletes, burnout, dropping out, steroid use, chronic injuries, and eating disorders. Anxiety, yet another issue in sport participation, can result from a win-at-all-costs philosophy that characterizes the pressure cooker world of big-time athletics. Furthermore, the same inclination increasingly characterizes youth sport. In the wake of the modern feminism movement that began in the early 1970s, a number of women's roles expanded into areas traditionally occupied by men. The world of sport was no exception. As you learned in Chapters 7 and 17, Title IX of the Education Amendments Act was passed in the United States in 1972. The landmark federal legislation prohibits sex discrimination in educational settings. Since its passage and implementation, enormous changes in the world of women's sports have taken place. For example, substantial gains have occurred in the number of sports offered, access to sport-related scholarships and facilities, and overall athletic budgets. However, although a record number of girls and women are participating in sports at all levels of competition, boys and men still outnumber their female counterparts and receive a disproportional amount of resources, and the number of women in positions of power in sport is stagnant, as you can see in this diagram here. Sociologists argue these trends are due to maintenance of power hierarchies, organizational structure, policies, and societal beliefs that preserve sport as a space that is still primarily by, about, and for men. With respect to sports offered on a nationwide basis in 2014, the average number of teams per college or university that were available for women was 8.83, an all-time high. Compared that with 1972, when the average number was 2.5 sports per school. The National Federation of State High School Associations reported more than 3 million girls, a record high, are now involved in interscholastic sports nationwide, compared with only 298,000 before Title IX in 1972. And more than just participation rates have skyrocketed in the wake of Title IX, the number of fans is exploding as well. Consider women's college basketball, one of the most popular women's sports. 98.8% of member NCAA institutions have a women's basketball team. During the NCAA 2016 season, 11.4 million women's basketball fans in all three divisions broke attendance records, which have increased for 30 consecutive years. The 2015 FIFA Women's World Cup, in which the United States beat Japan, set an all-time television viewership record at over 7 million, and the game became the most watched soccer match in the United States. Nearly half a century after the passage of Title IX, record numbers of girls and women are participating in sports. Some of the sport participation opportunities can lead to professional careers, such as playing in the National Women's Soccer League. Although women have made enormous progress in sport, assuming they have attained equality would be a mistake. Considering the following examples, more than 4 decades after the passage of Title IX, women received 43% of the participation opportunities at intercollegiate level, even though they represented 57% of all undergraduates nationwide. Moreover, athletic budgets, salaries for coaches, and access to facilities are nowhere near an equitable ratio. These disparities are not only put women's sports at a distinct disadvantage in building successful programs, but also send a powerful message about which sports and athletes are considered the most valued and important. Research indicates that before Title IX, women occupied the vast majority, more than 90% of all athletic director positions throughout women's intercollegiate sports. In 2014 and 2015, however, they accounted for only 18.8% of those same administrative positions. Similarly, women make up 10% or less of the Associated Press sports editors, assistant sport editors, and columnists, and between 11 and 16% of sport reporters and copy editors or designers, the people who decide what and how to write about sport. These facts make it undeniably clear that in terms of employment opportunities, particularly in high-ranking leadership positions, women still face a labyrinth of barriers that impede entry and career advancement. Many female athletes have become household names because of sport media coverage over the last few years, such as Ronda Rousey, Lydia Cho, Lindsey Vonn, Serena Williams, and Katie Ledecky immediately come to mind. Despite such progress, the first wave of sport media scholars over the past 3 decades convincingly demonstrated in 2 important ways how mainstream media treat sports women and sportsmen differently. First, although female athletes make up approximately 40% of all sport participants, they receive significantly less coverage than their male counterparts. On average, they receive only 2 to 4% of the total sports coverage, regardless of the medium, and this figure's decline. A second way that the mainstream media treat female athletes differently involves types of coverage. Numerous investigations have shown that the media portray male athletes in ways that emphasize their athletic strength and mental toughness, but they present women in ways that predominantly highlight their physical attractiveness and heterosexuality rather than their accomplishments as athletes. Currently, a second wave of sport media scholars are using intersectionality, how gender, class, race, and sexual orientations intersect in audience reception research frameworks to examine how diverse consumers or audiences interpret media images of female athletes and perceptions of whether sex sells women's sports. Sports sociology scholars also examine one of the most oppressive aspects of sport, homophobia. Pat Griffin, a leading scholar and advocate in this area and founder of Changing the Game, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network Sports Project, defined homophobia as a universal fear and intolerance toward gay and bisexual people. Although significant progress has occurred in this area, stereotypes continue to link gender roles with highly competitive athletes, particularly in team contact sports such as basketball and football. Traditional definitions of masculinity and heterosexuality were synonymous with real athletes. In contrast, traditional notions of femininity, sugar and spice, and everything nice were by definition the antithesis of athleticism. As a result, female athletes who dominate their sport and challenge stereotypes are often criticized as not being real women. Although homophobia is present in women's and men's athletics, fears or concerns about being gay have long been associated with women's sports. Such fears range from historical assertions that women's participation in sports will masculinize women or harm their reproductive capabilities and make them unable to fulfill what are presumed to be appropriate heterosexual roles, such as wife and mother, to modern-day claims that athletic involvement, particularly those who engage in more masculine sports, will turn women into lesbians. From athletes to coaches to athletic administrators, women are often stigmatized with the lesbian label. Research has demonstrated how homophobic beliefs and heterosexism affect the lives of female athletes and coaches daily. Given this reality, those involved in women's sports feel a great deal of pressure to act or appear to be heterosexual. The underlying fear is not that a female athlete or coach will appear too plain or out of style. The real fear is that she will look like a dyke, or even worse, is one. To this point, we focused on how homophobia affects women's sports, but as we all know, men's sports are particularly oppressive and intolerant when it comes to gay athletes. Scholars have suggested that this intolerance is due to the historical role of sport as a training and proving ground for men to establish their masculinity. Because traditional definitions of masculinity are synonymous with athleticism, it's not surprising that being a gay male athlete is perceived as a contradiction in terms. Former players such as Billy Beane in MLB, Esra Tualo in the NFL, and John Amaechi in the NBA are a few of the male athletes in major professional sports to come out, but they all waited until their careers were over to do so. The popularity held belief that African American athletes owe their success to their natural athletic abilities suggests that they have some genetic advantage over whites when it comes to achievement in sport. A parallel belief is that white athletes achieve excellence because of their discipline, intelligence, and hard work. This attributional pattern is often referred to as race logic. When people of color dominate a sport, a desire emerges to search for a black gene or an athletic gene associated with race to explain this dominance. The implications for focusing on a genetic link to athletic success are far-reaching. From a sociological standpoint, genetic-based reasoning ignores broader social and cultural explanations for ability differences, such as differential access, quality of coaches, and community resources and socialization. The second area, and one of the most widely studied forms of racial discrimination in sport, is a phenomenon called stacking, whereby minority groups are steered away from or into certain player positions that are more or less central to key decision-making and leadership positions on the field. For example, in MLB, whites have dominated the position of catcher, pitcher, and infielder, which are baseball's primarily thinking positions, and African Americans have been overrepresented in outfield positions that rely on speed. Although sport certainly has many problematic aspects as highlighted in this chapter, it can also help us overcome injustice, prejudice, and oppression. When it is structured and enforced with appropriate social values, the sport experience can instill in people a deep-seated commitment to making important and long-lasting contributions to society. Although we rarely think of sport in this manner, its enormity, popularity, and its ability to reach across social, political, and economic divides make it one of the few institutions that can serve The 1960s was a decade of significant social unrest and marked by assassinations of well-known leaders such as John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. Demonstrations in the streets and the killing of students on college campuses over the United States' involvement in Vietnam. Against this backdrop, the 1968 Olympic Summer Games took place in Mexico City. During the games, two African-American athletes, Tommy Smith and Juan Carlos, had won the gold and bronze medals respectively in the 200-meter dash, used the award ceremony to protest racial injustice. During the national anthem, Smith and Carlos lowered their heads and raised their black-gloved, closed fists in a gesture that was widely seen and criticized as an African-American power salute. Although they were stripped of their medals and vilified in the United States, their protest brought to light many of the injustices faced by African Americans and in some quarters revealed the hypocrisy of America as the land of the free. Sports sociologists argued that the protest of Smith and Carlos was not only one of the most memorable movements in the Olympic history, but also a milestone in the civil rights movement. In 2016, a series of fatal shootings of young black men at the hands of police officers ignited protests and civil unrest. Athletes used their celebrity as a platform to shed light on social issues in the United States. For example, Colin Kaepernick, who was an NFL quarterback with the San Francisco 49ers, made a social and political statement by kneeling during the Star-Spangled Banner, as you see here, the United States national anthem, in support of the Black Lives Matter movement and to protest police brutality and racial injustice. His statement inspired nearly 50 NFL players to kneel during the national anthem or raise a fist in solidarity. Sports sociology has many implications for sport managers. We've already discussed how individuals face challenges both on and off the court, and in so doing gain feelings of self-worth and empowerment. We've also examined broader social issues as the various and harmful ways the mainstream media portray female athletes, how racism is perpetuated throughout the sports world, and how homophobic stereotypes put coaches and athletes at great risk personally and professionally. At the same time, however, we have seen how the Olympic Games, professional sports, and big-time college athletics can unify cities and nations, and as a result, challenge and transcend bigotry, racism, and oppression. What all these scenarios have in common are people. Knowing about people is critical to success in sport management because the sport manager must understand the social context of sport and the meaning attached to that context to get people involved with and stay committed to a certain activity. The need for sport and physical activity is becoming increasingly important to health and offset the expenses attributed to chronic diseases due to physical inactivity. And a recent study, Far and Low, in 2016, found women who participated in sport have better health outcomes for all chronic diseases, including high cholesterol, cardiovascular disease, heart attack, arthritis, and depression. The intensity of sport and the amount of time spent being active increase their health benefits. This extends the argument that creating sport opportunities for all people is morally right thing to do. It also adds an economic justification through participation in sport and physical activity costs, with poor health can be reduced and in some cases eliminated. The debate over the use of Native American sport mascots have been contested over the last 35 years. The very act of having Native Americans as mascots evokes ethical discussion over right or wrong and good or bad that results or is perceived to result from this practice. According to Davis and Delano in 2007, Native American mascots were used by 5 professional sport teams: the Atlanta Braves, Chicago Blackhawks, Cleveland Indians, Kansas City Chiefs, and the Washington Redskins, which has since then changed their name. Approximately 15 to 20 colleges and universities and more than 2,900 high schools, middle schools, and elementary schools across the United States. There are no other ethnic minority groups who have experienced similar historic marginalization and discrimination similar to Native Americans in the United States. The position of scholars and activists on Native American mascots are based on 3 points. Number 1, imagery reflects and reinforces stereotypes and biases. Number 2, representations harm Native Americans. And 3, Native Americans have no control over such images. For example, the Chief Wahoo, the Cleveland Indians caricature mascot, is representative of images at the center of the debate. in contrast to individuals and institutions who defend the use of Native American mascots believe they are resisting political correctness, claim the images honor local tribes, or assert that the mascot has been supported by Native Americans. Institutions have shown reluctance to change their mascots because they fear economic backlash from loyal alumni, donors, or fans. This controversy has inspired position statements from the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and the American Sociological Association, and 2005 NCAA policy change banning postseason hosting for schools with Native American mascots. The debate over Native American imagery is far from over. For example, the Washington Redskins owner Daniel Snyder vowed to continue using the mascot despite two lawmakers threatening to hold hearings if the name is not changed. And we know now that it has changed. So obviously he was overruled. Here are a few questions that you probably will see on the test. How and why have sports come to symbolize broader social concerns throughout society? And why has the number of women in key leadership positions in sport declined dramatically over the past 4 years? Why does sports sociology have significant implications for sport managers? So in summary, sports sociology involves the scientific study of the social context of sport. Although sports sociologists study the various ways in which people participate in sport, they are primarily interested in the meaning of sport and its influence on our social, political, and economic institutions. Sport management is directly linked in theory and practice to sports sociology because both areas are influenced by the cultural and societal aspects of sport and physical activity. Sport has great prominence in society, and it shapes and perpetuates many important social and cultural values. The social benefits of sport include teaching children positive social roles and unifying diverse groups of people as they cheer for a team. Sport can also engender feelings of self-worth and sense of empowerment, but sport has negative aspects as well, such as sexism, racism, and violence within and outside sports settings. Finally, sport may serve as a vehicle for social transformation. Sport figures can enhance awareness of and sensitivity to social problems, such as racial injustice and homophobia. Understanding and appreciating the field of sports sociology can provide an important foundation for understanding the field of sport management. To be effective, the sport manager must be aware of the social aspects of sport. Considering that sport managers work with people in social settings, they must understand individuals and their social environments because they are continuously interacting and affecting each other. Sport managers can play an essential role in developing safe, positive, and enriching sport environments. When they do so, people can participate more fully and effectively in all aspects of sport as athletes, employees, fans, clients, or consumers. Sport is a much loved institution, and the exciting challenge for sport managers is to harness that love in ways that emphasize not only sound management skills, but also a sense of social responsibility that enriches us all. And that is all I have for today, guys. Y'all have a great day. I'll talk with you soon.